the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, the 3rd of September, 2024. 85 years ago, on this date, 3rd of September, 1939, the British declared war on Germany. Very dramatic day in world history. The Brits thought that they'd made peace with the Germans at Munich, but of course that was a delusion. And Auden wrote a very famous poem about this day. He said on September the 1st, 1939, I think that was the date that the Germans invaded Poland, Auden wrote, "I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade." My guest today on the show is a very distinguished historian, Giles Milton. He's written all sorts of books about the Second World War, and he has a new book out today in the US, The Stalin Affair. He's joining us from sunny Burgundy in France. Giles, was Auden right about the 30s in terms of the build up to the Second World War? Was it a shabby decade?
I think that's a pretty good description of it. And what is certainly the case is at the end of that decade, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact came as a massive shock to leaders around the world, because what happened is the two dictators in Europe, Hitler and Stalin, sworn enemies up to this point, enter into a friendship pact. And this changes everything geopolitically in Europe. It means that the two monstrous dictators in Europe are now on the same side. And of course, this will mark the beginning of the Second World War, because this enables them to carve up Poland between the two of them. The Wehrmacht march into Western Poland at the beginning of September, and the Soviet army, the Red Army, marches into Eastern Poland. At this point, Britain declares war on Adolf Hitler, and the Second World War has begun.
There are three dominant political figures in your book, or at least in the background of the book, The Stalin Affair, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill. Let's go back to 85 years ago today, Giles. What was Winston Churchill doing? He wasn't, of course, at that point, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He must have been feeling a mixture of vindication and fear. Would that be fair?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing with Churchill, given what is going to happen in a couple of years' time, is that Churchill, for his entire political career, had detested Stalin and everything that his regime represented. You know, this is a regime that wants to destroy the capitalist West. And so I think it was a cause of great shock to Winston Churchill, although he had predicted exactly this sort of thing could happen. The two dictators of Europe have entered into alliance, and this changes absolutely everything. And I think he knew very clearly that the world was moving inexorably towards a monumental war.
Well, the war had begun. So Churchill was shocked. It's hard to imagine Winston Churchill being shocked. He always seems to know everything beforehand, or at least claims to know everything. What about Stalin on the 3rd of September, 1939? He must have been feeling rather pleased with himself, wasn't he?
Yeah, Stalin. I mean, this is one of the hallmarks that we'll see throughout his career. He was an extremely adroit political maneuverer, and this for him was a fantastic deal to strike with Hitler, who he had never trusted, to actually enter into an alliance with him, which gave him a huge amount of territory. I mean, the Red Army marches into Eastern Poland. and behaves with the greatest possible brutality. They round up intellectuals, they round up army officers, they round up anyone who could be troubling to their new regime in occupied eastern Poland, and liquidate them. But for Stalin, it is a great triumph. He's just increased the landmass of his country enormously, and also created a buffer zone. If if Hitler were ever to tear up his treaty with Stalin and launch an invasion on the Soviet Union, there was at least now a buffer zone before the Wehrmacht would reach the Soviet frontier.
But it was ultimately, for Stalin at least, it was a catastrophic move. He was fooled by Hitler, wasn't he?
Stalin was indeed fooled by Hitler, and never did this become more clear than on the night of the 22nd of June, 1941. So we're winding forwards 2 years when Hitler...
Barbarossa, the beginning of your book in many ways.
Exactly. So this is the point at which Hitler tears up his treaty with Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. Now, this is the biggest invasion in the history of warfare. 3 million troops are going to pour over the frontier and start attacking the Soviet Union. And Stalin had been warned repeatedly and by numerous sources, spies, informers, and politicians, including Winston Churchill, that Hitler was about to, do this incredible act of betrayal, and Stalin refused to believe any of them. He said,
"Yeah, it's interesting that Churchill was never fooled by Hitler. Stalin was, but of course, in some ways, maybe Churchill was in some ways fooled by Stalin. And of course, the third figure in this three-way story is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What was he doing on September the 3rd, 1939? Was he, in his own way, trying to figure out how he was going to make everybody happy?
I think so. It's interesting with Roosevelt looking throughout these turbulent months and years. He is often the slowest to react, and indeed, when Operation Barbarossa takes place, that invasion of the Soviet Union, Churchill reacts immediately, makes a famous address to the nation on the very day of the invasion, whereas Roosevelt doesn't say anything on the day of the invasion itself. And indeed, it's some days before he makes a public announcement. It's almost as if he's sort of mulling over much more thoughtfully about the path to tread.
Would it be fair to say, and we're getting to Barbarossa in a second, Giles, but would it be fair to say that given the almost impossible political coalition that FDR had successfully managed for almost 10 years, the alliance of labor and African Americans and segregationists in the South, that of the three, Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, he was the most politically skilled. Stalin, of course, just murdered his enemies, whereas the British political system, Churchill was always an outsider who, in a sense, got lucky because of the war.
But I think Roosevelt had to tread a very delicate balance as well, because there was a very powerful lobby that did not want America in another war, especially a war taking place on the European continent. And Roosevelt was, extremely aware of this and had to play his cards extremely carefully. And that's why I think we see, yes, maybe he was being politically adroit, but one gets a sense that he doesn't want to put himself too forwards and compromise the American position.
Yeah, the history, of course, repeats itself. The American firsters of the late 30s, early 40s were very powerful. So let's move to the beginning of your book. We've talked about September the 3rd, 1939. This invasion of Russia, Soviet Russia by Nazi Germany, the 22nd of June, 1941. Again, in retrospect, whilst Stalin was made a fool of, it was the dumbest thing that Hitler could have ever done. Why did he do it?
Well, you're right in saying that. And in fact, when Churchill was woken on the morning of the 22nd of June and told that Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union, the first thing Churchill did was reach out of his bed and light a celebratory cigar, because he indeed agreed that this was the stupidest thing that Hitler had ever done. He realized that Hitler was now fighting a war on two fronts. His armies were going to be overstretched. And there was a glimmer of hope at last, even in these desperate days, early days of the Second World War, that Hitler might have overreached himself and could now be defeated.
So let's remind ourselves of what happened after Barbarossa. These were the darkest days of Stalin's political career. He disappeared for a while. Was he genuinely shocked? Did he have no suspicions that Hitler was about to invade? I mean, you said that a lot of people were telling him. Was he unwilling to acknowledge that he'd made the original mistake? Why was he? Because he was such a political realist, such a hard-headed fellow. Why didn't he believe what anyone was telling him?
It's really interesting. He was in complete denial. And there were even deserters from the German army. This is like communist sympathizers in the German army who crossed the Soviet frontier in advance of the invasion to warn the Soviet border police what was about to happen. And this message was relayed to Stalin in Moscow. And he simply ordered for all of these German deserters to be shot. He didn't believe that this was going to happen. He didn't believe that Hitler was going to tear up his alliance. And as you say, once the news broke that the German army had indeed crossed the frontier, he almost suffered a sort of a breakdown. He leaves Moscow, he goes to his dacha, his holiday home in the countryside, and refuses to see anyone and refuses to take any phone calls for 4 or 5 days. He's in complete denial that this is actually taking place.
What about the people around Stalin? It was such a bloody system of murder and counter murder. Do you get the sense that they conceive? Because I mean, this embarrassed Stalin more than anyone else. He was the man who believed in Hitler, or at least trusted Hitler. Were there any mutterings within the military or of Stalin's most senior associates? He had killed most of them in the 1930s, but the ones that were left, that Stalin should be made to pay for this terrible error?
Well, this is a very interesting, the hours and days that followed the German invasion, where of course a point of great crisis, and the Wehrmacht was advancing rapidly. You know, the blitzkrieg tactics of the Wehrmacht meant that they were driving deep into Soviet territory, and yes, Stalin's senior generals and senior politicians were deeply alarmed to find that the leader, who, you know, Stalin controlled absolutely everything, had simply retired and refused to see anyone. And they were so alarmed, in fact, that after a few days of inaction, total inaction, and being unable to contact Stalin, they go to the dacha outside Moscow and they beg him to reassume the leadership of the Soviet Union. And it should be said that Stalin they found him cowering in his dining room, so terrified, he thought that they'd come to arrest and shoot him. Quite the opposite was the case. They come to beg him to take charge of the Soviet Union and lead the Soviet war effort against this ongoing invasion. So really a moment of profound and serious crisis in the Soviet Union.
And of course, just as Hitler later was cowering, committed suicide, a certain justice in that. Stalin, of course, had millions of people's lives on his hands, the blood of millions, not just Bolsheviks and Russians, but of course, those people who perished in the various famines. What about FDR? Again, the third character, in a way, the most elusive and interesting of these three, Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. On the 22nd of June, 1941, I'm not sure if FDR, I don't know if he smoked cigars, certainly not like Churchill. When he heard the news, what was his reaction?
Well, absolute silence for quite a long time. He said absolutely
Classic
nothing.
FDR, right?
Unlike Churchill, who immediately that very day made this public address to the nation saying that despite the fact he detested Stalin and his regime all his political career, he was now going into an alliance with him and was trying to take the British people with him. FDR says precisely nothing. And it's some days before he even gives a press conference and vaguely says that the Lend-Lease program, the famous program to provide weapons and munitions and supplies to the British Isles, would be extended to the Soviet Union. But he's very vague in his. We have transcripts of the meetings he has with journalists at the White House. He's extremely vague, and it's only what's happening behind the scenes, out of the public eye, where in fact there are contacts being made with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and decisions are being made that America is going to throw its money and its military might behind the Soviet Union. But it's very interesting. There's the competing styles here of Churchill and Roosevelt. They could not be more different.
And of course, Churchill fancied himself a bit, but he always felt a bit inadequate around FDR. FDR brought out all his insecurities. Just to remind ourselves in historical terms, of course, the Americans were still 6 months off from being in the war. Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941. As I said earlier, FDR seems to have spent his life negotiating all the different interests within his coalition. What was the result of the American firsters' response to both the declaration of war in September 39 and then Barbarossa? I'm guessing the classic American firster, the isolationist, sort of said, well, we told you so. These tyrants are fighting each other. Why should we be involved?
That's pretty much exactly what they said. They said that it would be politically inconceivable, they said, for America to go rally behind the red banner of Joseph Stalin. So there's a very powerful voice there. There are other voices as well. And one of the most interesting is Truman, who said he had a deeply cynical approach. He said, if the Russians are winning, we should supply the Germans with weaponry. And if the Germans are winning, we should supply the Russians with weaponry, and that way they can each kill as many as possible. So a variety of voices, but you're right, the America First was very, very powerful, and that I think largely explains why FDR was so reticent to make any public statements, officially endorsing Joseph Stalin and an alliance with the Soviet Union at this period.
So the subtitle of your book, that alliance, is called The Impossible Alliance That Won the War. I mean, obviously it wasn't impossible because it happened. Why, though, perhaps in retrospect, did it seem impossible? Was it simply because of the strong isolationist lobby in the US?
It wasn't just that. It was, here are three men who profoundly disagree on a lot of things. And when you actually see them, when they come together at the big three conferences, when we actually see them in the room together, you get a glimpse of just how politically wide apart they were. So you obviously have Stalin, the monstrous dictator, liquidated millions of his own people. You have Roosevelt, who detests the British Empire, and Churchill, who stands absolutely as a sort of personification of empire. And so Roosevelt will do everything he can to undermine Churchill and sort of gang up on Churchill against Churchill with Stalin. And then Churchill is doing the same with Stalin. He's trying to befriend Stalin against President Roosevelt. So you have these it's these bizarrely competing figures, competing for attention, competing for each other's favors, and all the time trying to get the best for themselves and undermine the others while they're doing it.
Yeah, it's a model for game theory, for a three-way game theory, really. I mean, I'm not a game theorist, but I'm sure there are people watching. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt all involved in this game. It was a great game. It was the greatest game, perhaps, of the 20th century. Do you think that Churchill's association with America, the fact I think his mother was American and he was always a great admirer of the United States, spent some of his life there, did that help in some way? I know Roosevelt, as you said, didn't much like the British Empire and was contemptuous in some ways of Churchill.
I think up to a point, yes, but I think where everything changes in the relationship and everything that's going to happen is when Roosevelt sends Averell Harriman to
and who's
London.
the sort of the fourth man, if you like. There's of course the famous movie The Third Man, but yes. William Averell Harriman is the fourth man in your narrative, The Stalin Affair. Tell us about him.
Yeah, I'm sure many people will know about him or heard of him. But Averell Harriman was the fourth richest man in America. He was chairman of the Union Pacific Railroad. He owned Sun Valley Ski Resort. He was fabulously wealthy, and he was also a friend of Roosevelt. And now, what happened in the beginning of 1941, in the early months of 1941, is that Roosevelt sent him to London to be his direct and personal representative to Winston Churchill. And from the moment that Harriman arrives in London, he is going to be with Churchill virtually every waking hour. He's going to be there living in 10 Downing Street. He's going to be in Chequers, which is the Churchill's country residence. And he has, Churchill befriends Harriman, partly because he's very powerful, but certainly because he is a direct link to Roosevelt. So if he needs something, he knows the message will get through immediately. And so, Churchill befriended Averell Harriman. He also befriended Harry Hopkins, another name that I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with. So Churchill befriended the right Americans, the Americans who could ensure that weaponry, supplies, food, etc., got to the British Isles from America.
And of course, when Averell Harriman wasn't with Churchill, he was with his daughter-in-law, who he had an affair with. He certainly was, and if there's such a thing as an American aristocrat, he also had his own business interests. As you say, he was the fourth richest man. He was an industrial baron, titan in his own way. He had economic interests, which in some ways perhaps were compromised by the war and by the German economy. Tell us about that.
I think it's important to mention actually that why was Harriman chosen by Roosevelt? I think he was chosen, first of all, he was extremely intelligent. He was extremely personable. He was charming. He knew how to talk to people. And you mentioned the fact
he looks like Jimmy Stewart. Is he a real life version of Jimmy Stewart?
Yes. He was, everyone said he's older in the photo you're showing there, but when he came to London, he was extremely good looking. And as you mentioned, you hinted at there, but is certainly the case that within a week of arriving in Great Britain, he was in bed with Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law. So that gives some hints.
Well, Winston, think about that one. I bet he didn't light a cigar when he heard that news, did he?
Well, you know what? The Churchills knew what was taking place, but this was an age of great discretion. And of course, it should be mentioned, because it's another important character in my book and in this story, is that Averell came to London with his daughter, Cathy, who was a glamorous 23-year-old American socialite. And
who became a journalist, right? She worked
became a journalist. But she also worked as her father's aide. And she was, lit up every soiree that Averell or Harriman would go to. She became extremely close friends of Pamela Churchill, who her father was sleeping with. And she also was living at number 10 Downing Street and at the Chequers, the Churchill's country residence. And so what we get from Cathy, as you say, she's working as a journalist, but she also is an inveterate letter writer. And she writes hundreds of personal letters to her sister in New York describing life in the Churchill household. And what's fascinating with these letters is you're getting a fly-on-the-wall view of exactly what was unfolding at the epicenter of the British war effort. And of course, within a couple of years, she and her father would be sent to Moscow to do exactly the same thing, working alongside Stalin. So you have this peek from behind the curtains at all the greatest moments of the Second World War.
And then just as Barbarossa and the Polish invasion changed everything, did Pearl Harbor change everything in terms of what you call this impossible alliance? Would it have been possible without Pearl Harbor?
No, Pearl Harbor changed everything, and we're very lucky that Cathy was at Chequers that very night with her father, with Churchill, when they turned on the 9 o'clock news on the BBC, and they heard that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And Churchill, he'd been hungover all day. He'd had far too much alcohol on the previous evening. He'd been sitting all day with his head in his hands. And when he hears this news, he leaps up from his armchair and throws his arms into the air and shouts out, "We're going to declare war on Japan." He knew this changed everything. He ran to the telephone. He phoned Roosevelt immediately, and the two of them said, decided there and then they were going to declare a war on Japan. This was After Operation Barbarossa, this was the biggest news for Churchill, or the best news.
I'm guessing you would have lit a cigar as well, although it was the evenings, probably already smoking one. Let's remind ourselves then, because there's a lot of moving parts, Giles, to your story. It focuses on would it be fair to say that the Stalin Affair really focuses, at least at the beginning, on Anglo-American support for the Russians during the Nazi invasion? Where were we at Pearl Harbor in terms of the British and the Americans giving support, military or otherwise, to the Russians? Because in December 1941, things were pretty dire on the Eastern Front, weren't they? At least from the Russian point of view.
From the Russian point of view, they were an absolute disaster. The three army groups, German army groups, had swept into the country. And by December 1941, so just after Pearl Harbor, the German army is knocking on the gates of Moscow. Quite literally, the Wehrmacht troops could see the gilded domes of the Kremlin. They were that close. So this was a catastrophic.
And they besieged St. Petersburg, it wasn't Leningrad at that point.
Yeah, so. Indeed. And they were sweeping into the Ukraine and capturing the oil fields of the Ukraine as well. This was a really disastrous moment. Now, all through this time, America had been supplying Great Britain with munitions, with weaponry, with supplies, with food, to keep the Great Britain afloat. Great Britain was in dire straits. It was on the brink of starvation, and American aid was flowing into the British Isles. But the big question was, should some of this be shipped on to the Soviet Union? And this was how the Lend-Lease would eventually unfold. That a deal would be done whereby America and Great Britain are directly supplying the Soviet Union with vast quantities of tanks, of planes, of jeeps, and all sorts of military hardware.
Stalin seems to have experienced the kind of, as you say, maybe a nervous breakdown. He changed the way he thought about the world, or at least it changed the way in which he presented himself to the world, and particularly Russia. He dropped a lot of the Leninist stuff or Stalinist stuff and focused on Russian nationalism. Did the German invasion of Russia, and then of course Pearl Harbor, did that change how people in the West, particularly in the US, viewed Stalin and the Soviet Union?
I think that, most sensible people reading between the lines, they realized that this was a marriage of convenience, that there was no long-term future in this alliance. I think a lot of people realized that this was simply a way to win the war against Hitler.
It was, as to borrow the word from your title, it was an affair rather than the marriage, the Stalin affair rather than the Stalin marriage.
It was indeed that. And I think ultimately, both Churchill and Roosevelt, they hoped that this alliance would continue into the post-war period. But, this was clearly not going to happen. It was an alliance, and I call it impossible because I think it would have been impossible without the men and women behind the scenes desperately trying to keep together this alliance, which was threatened, constantly threatened with falling apart. One thing that I should say that Stalin wanted in 1941 and was demanding of Churchill was that Britain and America launch D-Day. So, D-Day ultimately happened on the 6th of June, 1944. Stalin wanted it to happen in 1941, which was, of course, totally absurd and impossible, as Churchill pointed out to Stalin. But Stalin was desperate for some relief from the onslaught that was taking place on the Eastern Front. As I said, the Wehrmacht is at the gates of Moscow. They're almost about to capture the city. He needed some sort of diversion and begged his Western allies to do something which they simply couldn't do at that time.
We've done many shows, Giles, as you can imagine, on the Second World War, and are reminded by a number of historians that the two most consequential fronts in military terms were the Eastern Front and the Asian Front. The traditional narrative, obviously always presented in Russia itself, was that it was the Russians who defeated the Germans. Was there a lot of Western aid, Anglo-American aid, particularly American aid, to Russia in this invasion that changed the nature of the military conflict, or was it mostly political.
Yeah, there was a vast amount of aid, and this is something certainly in Russia today you will never ever hear anything about the Lend-Lease program. Multi-millions of tons of supplies were shipped to the Soviet Union. First of all, they came in through the Arctic route, the famous Arctic convoys, shipping supplies to Murmansk and Archangel up in the north of Russia. But when that route became too dangerous, because the Luftwaffe were constantly bombing these convoys, Averell Harriman hit on the idea of supplying the Soviet Union through Iran, which had been occupied by the British and the Soviets, and so launched this extraordinary operation, logistic operation, involving tens of thousands of American soldiers and railroad men who began freighting across Iran up into the underbelly of the Soviet Union. I mean, multi-million tons of jeeps, of planes, of tanks and everything. And this definitely made a material difference to the course of the war on the Eastern Front. And in fact, even Stalin, in private, notably never in public, said that they would not have won on the Eastern Front without American aid. That's a narrative that has been dropped from all Russian history books.
Yeah, I'm thinking of affairs. They tend to be private, secretive things rather than public ones. I'm guessing that one of the things that united both Stalin and FDR, and less Churchill perhaps, was keeping all this private. It didn't benefit either Stalin or FDR to reveal how, excusing all these rather childish metaphors, Giles, they were in bed together.
Yeah, this was, and there were moments of great crisis. The first time that Churchill goes to Moscow in the summer of 1942, Churchill goes to meet Stalin face to face. He's very excited about meeting his greatest political enemy face to face, and the meeting was an absolute unmitigated disaster. Stalin was profoundly rude to Churchill. He insulted him, and Churchill there and then declares that he's leaving Moscow the following morning. He's tearing up the wartime alliance, and that the Soviet Union is getting no more aid from Great Britain. This is an absolute disaster. And this is one of those, you're talking of covering things up and keeping things secret. This is one of the moments where people like Harriman, the British ambassador, Archie Clark Kerr, who plays a big role in all of this, they have to keep all this secret. It's absolutely imperative that this fractious relationship it doesn't get into Germany, because it's a big absolute gift for Adolf Hitler if he knows this. So secrecy is all important. The other thing is, it should be mentioned, these, of course, we were allies. The British, the Americans, and the Soviets are all allies. But of course, the Soviets are bugging the American embassy. They're bugging the British embassy. It's a very, very odd and unpredictable alliance.
It was an affair. It ended. It didn't result in marriage. In retrospect, I think a marriage would have been a better thing. Certainly, the Second World War was followed by the Cold War. Were there ever moments, Giles, when it could have resulted in a marriage? Had Churchill been replaced? Had Chamberlain perhaps come back, who believed in things? Or was the problem with Stalin in the sense that, having been deceived by Hitler, he never trusted anyone again?
Well, I think there was one point where genuinely there was a feeling that this alliance was going to last into the post-war world, and that was at the famous Yalta conference, which took place at the beginning of 1945. The Allies, they know they're going to win the war. Victory is not very far off, in fact, and they sit down at the table and they plan the architecture of the post-war world.
And FDR was there, but he was very sick. Is that right?
Well, this is one of the problems. FDR was very sick. In fact, he was dying and would be dead shortly after the conference. Churchill also was very much under par. He was an old man by this point. He was tired and he was drinking extremely heavily. And the problem, and Stalin, he kind of knew it by the Yalta conference that he had already got everything he wanted, because the Red Army was already advancing into Eastern and Central Europe. It was advancing across Poland into Germany. So he knew that he was going to get everything he wanted. And it was left rather to Roosevelt and Churchill wondering how they were going to get their share of the post-war world. But for the aides and the diplomats who were at Yalta, they believed that the friendship, the smiles around the banqueting tables, the generous toasts they all made for each other, they genuinely believed they were entering a new period in which the Soviet Union would play a full and responsible part on the world stage.
And what about your fourth man, Averell Harriman, a very worldly man in every sense? Did he understand that, or did he recognize that there was going to be another war, maybe not a hot war, but a war that divided the world between an American and a Soviet satellite state?
Well, in the spring of 1945, all the world leaders and their diplomats and functionaries, they all gather in San Francisco. This is to set up the fledgling United Nations, which is going to be the world's policeman, if you like, for the post-war world. It's a great moment of great triumph for everyone, and a moment of great optimism, except for Averell Harriman, who stands up in front of, on the world stage and announces that Stalin can no longer be trusted, that he can no longer be a partner in the post-war world, that he has plans to take over much of Eastern and Central Europe, and that the alliance that has brought the Allies to the brink of victory here should be torn up in the post-war world. Now, his words cause absolute shock and revulsion on the world stage. People are accusing him of being this multimillionaire who was out of touch with everything. But of course, ultimately, he was right. He knew Stalin very well. He'd seen him face to face on countless occasions, and he knew that Stalin could not be trusted. And he was trying to issue a warning to the world that this alliance could not last into the post-war world.
That conference in San Francisco was one that Eleanor Roosevelt was quite prominent. But by this time, I think FDR had died. Truman was president. Did that change everything too in terms of the end of the Stalin Affair?
I think it did. And then we come to the last great conference of the big three. That's the big three wartime leaders. Well, they've changed by the Potsdam Conference, which is in the summer of 1945, just after victory in the Second World War. Truman, who has very little experience, as we said, on the international stage, nevertheless, I think plays quite a shrewd game with Stalin. He knows exactly what Stalin's up to. And of course, he announces to Stalin the great momentous news that America has developed the atomic bomb. Churchill has lost the general election of 1945, and halfway through the Potsdam Conference, he goes back to Great Britain and is replaced by a new Prime Minister, Attlee. And this changes everything. So really, there's a sense that everything is changing. The only person who's still sort of standing in his post is Joseph Stalin, who, by this point, has got what he wants. He's got Eastern Europe, he's got the Baltic states, he's got Poland, and his troops are occupying Berlin. He's hoping to get not only Berlin, but all of Germany. And this, of course, this is the beginning of the Cold War, and this is where Britain and America will face down Joseph Stalin in Berlin. And ultimately, when Stalin blockades the city and tries to kick the Americans and the Brits out of Berlin, they will launch the famous Berlin airlift, which will save the western sectors of the city for the democratic West.
As I said, the subtitle of the book is "The Impossible Alliance That Won the War." Could we have added another sentence to that? The impossible alliance that won the war and triggered the Cold War. Was there in the way in which it was presented as an affair, as this short-term thing, was there, in your view, as a historian looking back, you know this period, Giles, as well as anyone. Was there a certain inevitability, do you think, about the Cold War, independent of these great men, Churchill, Stalin, FDR? Some were defeated at the polls, others died. Do you think ultimately this affair was inevitably going to end?
I think ultimately Stalin overplayed his hand, and he overplayed it in Berlin. And Berlin carried such a symbol for the Western Allies that Berlin was the goal for the American and British forces and Canadians who landed on D-Day. You know, they all had written on their jeeps to Berlin. And when Stalin launched his blockade of the Western sectors, this was just, he'd gone one step too far. And this made, I think this is where it was decided, principally by the Americans, in fact, that they were going to make a stand. That he was not going to get Berlin. or any other territories in Germany, in Western occupied Germany. He overplayed his hand. They called his bluff with the Berlin airlift, which Stalin never believed would be able to supply, millions of West Berliners with enough supplies, but it did succeed. And ultimately, Stalin was forced into a humiliating climb down in Berlin.
Giles, what is this? The way you tell the story, I mean, you're a popular historian. This new book, I'm sure, will be, your books tend to be bestsellers. It might be made into a movie. You're not an academic historian. And I mean that in the best way as a compliment. But some of the characters in the book, you mentioned Archibald Clark Kerr, a classic, eccentric, dashing British aristocrat. Averell Harriman, who had the affair with Churchill's daughter-in-law. These were upper-class, powerful men making the policy on the behalf of the world. Millions of people around the world, tens of millions of people were dying. In a broad sense, did these elites, did their behavior sort of vindicate the conservative argument that men like Harriman and Kerr and Churchill and FDR should be running the world? Or does it suggest something rotten? I quoted Auden's September 1, 1939, this dishonest decade. Was there a degree of dishonesty, of rottenness that was continued by these elites who managed the war? In a sense, of course, it was a victory, but ultimately, certainly for the United Kingdom, it was a catastrophe.
Yeah, I think I would take issue on one point that they were not all highborn aristocrats, and that's what makes them so interesting. So Archie Clark Kerr, you showed a page there which sees him as Lord Inverchapel, which he became, but in fact he was from extremely humble background. He hadn't been to Eton, the elite school where all diplomats went to. He hadn't been to Oxford. He was a maverick and eccentric, but he knew how to communicate with people. He knew how to talk to people, and he, as soon as he got to Moscow, he managed to talk on a human level with Stalin. Bizarrely, he entered into a strange friendship with Joseph Stalin. Now, this was to prove absolutely critical because he was one of the people who was managing this improbable affair that was taking place between Churchill and Stalin. So, yeah, I take your point. A lot of them came from a very closed world.
I mean, Harriman was a Groton and Yale, like so many of the other American elites.
Yes, but he was.
And FDR, of course. Churchill was from the British aristocratic family.
Indeed. But Harriman, yes, he was an American aristocrat, if you can put it like that. But also, he had absolutely zero experience of diplomacy, and so he was an unusual choice in a way. But again, he was chosen because he had people skills, and these were to prove all important. And so these people who were working behind the scenes to keep this relationship on track, this alliance on track, they had one thing in common, which is they knew how to work with people. They knew how to talk to people. They were brilliant at managing people, and that was to prove absolutely critical when you've got three wartime leaders with massive egos who disagree on almost everything.
Well, Giles, let's fast forward to today, 85 years later. The headlines are of another war on what was then the Eastern Front, the Russian-Ukrainian war, another dictator, Vladimir Putin. What if anything, does the Stalin Affair, this impossible alliance that won the war, tell us about dealing with the new dictator, or perhaps dictators in the world, whether it's in Russia or China? Are there any lessons to learn from the Stalin Affair for the world of the 2020s, for a world in which Russia has invaded Ukraine and China might indeed invade Taiwan?
Yeah, and Russia, incidentally, which has put it re-erecting statues of Stalin all over the country, which is
we've done shows on that where Stalin's back in fashion. Not just officially, but unofficially too. He's become a cult hero amongst the young.
Indeed, no, it's well. You know what? I wrote a book, Checkmate in Berlin, which is I wrote it. It was my previous book, but actually, it's almost like a sequel.
First battle of the Cold War.
Yeah, and this feature, one of the key characters is the American commandant of Berlin during the crisis, during the airlift, Frank Howling Mad Howley. And he he wrote a very interesting thing where he said that when you're dealing with Russians and when you're dealing with Russian dictators, there is only one language they understand, and that is force. And he said that they have to be met with force wherever. I mean, it's a certain, the famous American diplomat George Kennan said exactly the same thing in his long telegram, that where, they don't understand the logic of reason, they only understand the logic of force, which is why I think that the West has to continue to supply as many weapons as possible to Ukraine, and so it can defeat this monstrous invasion.
And what do, if the Russians only understand the language of force, what do the Americans, the British don't seem to matter anymore, what do the Americans understand? Is it material interest that someone like Avril Harriman seemed to understand?
Yeah, I think material interest is extremely important. I think already I was talking to a businessman not so long ago in Britain, a South African, who is people are already looking to the rebuilding of the Ukraine. They're already looking to how they're going to make millions out of rebuilding this totally destroyed country. So there's always vested interests going on. But before the country can be rebuilt, there's got to be some sort of peace deal with Russia, or Russia's got to be defeated. So that's a long way off, I think, at the moment.
And finally, Giles, let's have a note about Great Britain. Not so great anymore. Post-Brexit Great Britain. You're a Brit living in or spending some of your life in Burgundy. Was this the last great fling? We're talking about the Stalin Affair in Great British history. Churchill's odd affair with Stalin and FDR. After this, we just have decline, don't we?
Churchill himself was aware of that. He wrote at one of the conferences, I think it was the Tehran conference, where he met with Roosevelt and Stalin. He said, I'm sitting here, and he said, I've got the great Russian bear on one side of me, and I've got the great American buffalo on the other side of me, and here I am, the poor little English donkey. I think that Churchill was a realist, and he realized that the power of Great Britain had been broken by the Second World War, and that America was going to be the world superpower, for the next X decades.
Can't beat that, Giles, imagining Churchill and Great Britain as a donkey. Congratulations on the new book. I think, as I said, it's bound to be a bestseller. All your books seem to be. The Stalin Affair, fascinating book, fascinating thesis. The Impossible Alliance that won the war. We'll have to get you back on. You're working on a new book?
I'm just starting. It's very, very early days at the moment, but I've got an idea and I'm working on it.
Well, we'll get you back, Giles, when it's finished. Congratulations, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks.